Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the Basics of Vendor Risk Assessments webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Questions, Media Player, Slides, Related Content widget, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. All the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, who will cover the basics of vendor risk assessments. Your internal inherent vendor risk assessment identifies the risk types and sizes present in a vendor relationship. However, how do you know if your vendor has what's necessary to manage those risks? Hillary is going to share the ins and outs of vendor risk assessments, including vendor questionnaires, document collection, and identifying issues. She also plans to explore the various roles involved in a vendor risk assessment before, during, and after. You'll also see a link to our copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, our what, why, when, who, and where of vendor risk assessments infographic, our what are inherent and residual third-party risk ebook, and our Identifying Critical Vendors 6 Foolproof Questions infographics. You will also find a link to our library of additional resources all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jessie, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the basics of vendor risk assessments. We're going to really jump into those basics and really get into some of the roles and responsibilities that are so instrumental to the process. We're going to talk about questionnaires, and we're going to jump into what kind of documents you need to collect for due diligence and what you do when you can't get something. We'll also talk about issue management and how to deal with resource constraints, and we'll wrap it all up with some best practices. So let's get started. All right, let's take a look at the basics. First of all, who is responsible for assessments? Well, obviously the vendor owner and third-party risk managers, but let's not forget about executive leadership who need to ensure that the process is taking place and is effective. We have other stakeholders such as subject matter experts who also play a major part in the process. So what is a vendor risk assessment? It is the standardized and systematic analysis of those risks posed to your organization by the product or service and the vendor relationship. It's also the evaluation of the controls used to mitigate those risks. We do them at the beginning of the relationship, always before we sign a contract, and then periodically throughout that relationship. We can also do them when there are material changes, such as a merger or acquisition, or a big regulatory change. And that brings us to the why. Well, first of all, it is a best practice to look before you leap, as they say. It also helps us stay in line with your strategy because we're preventing the organization from taking unnecessary risks by protecting our clients and customers, not to mention protecting our reputation and brand. And finally, for those that are regulated, it's a requirement. Well, there are many roles and responsibilities layered into the vendor risk assessment process. But let's take a look at the 3 most important goals, starting with the vendor risk management team. Now, in general, vendor risk management is the team or the individual that owns the vendor risk management framework. That means all the rules, tools, and processes that make vendor risk management possible at an organization. They're also responsible for overseeing the process and holding the stakeholders accountable. But when it comes to vendor risk assessments in particular, they have several core responsibilities. So first of all, they establish all the criteria to determine if a vendor is critical. And they own the methodology and the mechanisms to provide the risk rating for each vendor. They act as sort of an air traffic control, making sure that the process is executed in the proper order and per the defined requirements. They also establish all the requirements for due diligence, everything from determining which questions are on a vendor risk questionnaire to what documents to collect and the scope of due diligence required based on the risk level. When issues are surfaced during a review, they are responsible for tracking and monitoring those issues until they're closed. Often this means working with SMEs, vendor owners, and even the vendors to do that. They set the schedule for all periodic risk reviews, due diligence, and performance monitoring. And they're responsible for providing the reports detailing the status of due diligence, those upcoming risk reviews, and any open issues. Finally, if the vendor risk process is in scope for an audit or an exam, they will represent the process. They'll gather the documentation and are on point for interviews with the auditor or examiner. That's a lot, but they are only part of the total equation. So let's take a look at vendor owners. Vendor owners or relationship managers are those individuals who actually own the vendor relationship. And as such, they own all the risk associated with it. They are accountable for ensuring that vendor risk is appropriately identified, assessed, and managed throughout the entirety of the relationship. They're also responsible for meeting the requirements and following the processes as they're defined by vendor risk management. And they're responsible for making sure that their vendors do the same. Okay, for vendor owners, they play a huge part in this process as well. For starters, they should be researching the background, qualifications, and reputations of the vendors they wish to bring forward, and that should be done way before we ever get to that vendor risk assessment stage. They're also responsible for completing the inherent risk assessment so we can determine if the vendor will be critical and we can establish a risk rating. Once that risk rating is established and we know the vendor is headed into due diligence, the vendor owner should be educating that vendor on the process and making sure they can get into the system, that they understand all the requirements, etc. They're also responsible for making sure the vendor is responsive to all those requests and returns all the documentation on time. If they find their vendor is lagging or past due, they really need to engage that vendor directly and get them back on track. When due diligence is completed, that vendor owner should be reading the report prepared by the SMEs and make themselves aware of any findings, gaps, or weaknesses that surface during the review. If there are issues that need to be addressed before the contract is signed, then they are on point to work with the vendor and the SME to manage that remediation and seek formal approval to close the issue. That means they need to hold their vendor accountable for that remediation. So suppose an issue surfaces that is not a deal breaker, but we do want them to fix it. The vendor owner needs to ensure that the remediation language is added to the contract before it's signed. Finally, vendor owners have that obligation and responsibility to practice risk and performance management on an ongoing basis and prepare themselves and the vendor for those periodic reviews. That brings us to our subject matter experts, or SMEs as we call them. These are the individuals who can be internal or external that are responsible for providing a professional and qualified opinion regarding the sufficiency of mitigating controls. Now I need to point out that the role of SME cannot just be filled by any old buddy. These individuals must have extensive knowledge and understanding of their respective risk areas. So much to the point that they often hold professional accreditations or certifications for those risk domains. This is important because we're relying on these subject matter experts to provide a qualified opinion that we are going to work with and take moving forward. So obviously the SMEs are responsible for the actual risk assessments. They're the ones putting the eyes on the paper, reviewing those questionnaires, looking at all the documentation, adding follow-up questions. They may be even interviewing SMEs at the vendors organization. And they do this so that they can put together a documented, formal report of that review that includes the scope of the review, all the documents and other information considered, any findings, which would include gaps, weaknesses, or issues, and their qualified opinion as to whether or not the organization should feel safe moving forward with that engagement. But the SME role really does extend beyond all these reviews. After all, we need these experts to collaborate with vendor risk management to establish the questions on the vendor risk questionnaire and set all those standards for the documentation to be collected. They also need to be consulted to weigh in on new or emerging risks that may be taking place at the organizational, regulatory, or industry level. Now let's turn our attention to the vendor risk management lifecycle. Many of you are probably familiar with this. You may have seen it in a wheel or a round presentation before. Don't worry, it's essentially the same thing. We've just pulled it out into a linear path, which makes it much easier to follow. Now, it's important to pay attention in the life cycle and execute the processes in the right order. Why? Because your risk considerations are slightly different in the beginning than they are within an established relationship. For example, when we have no experience with a vendor, they're brand new, we're basically going to go over them with a fine-tooth comb. We're going to research their background, their qualifications, their reputations. We're going to look at all the risks associated with that potential relationship and perform due diligence and the vendor risk assessment to ensure the control environment can safely manage those risks. And we're also structuring the contract to help us manage all of the known risks. But once we have an active vendor relationship, the risk considerations change somewhat. Now we're adding vendor performance to the mix and monitoring to the mix, so we're constantly looking at them for new or emerging risks. But even though we're having first-hand experience of that vendor, we still need to, on a periodic basis, review the risk and collect or update due diligence documents. We do this annually for critical or high-risk vendors. Now we know not all vendor relationships should be treated the same. Again, we're always working on the principle of proportionality, so the scope of any activity we do from a vendor risk management perspective should be in proportion to the risk presented by the relationship. So one of the things that can help us determine how to treat a vendor is to determine if they're critical to our organization or not. So criticality is really about business impact, and it speaks to that small subset of vendors that would really negatively impact your organization or your customers should they fail or have an unplanned outage, etc. So a good way to determine if a vendor is critical is to ask one of these three questions. Would a sudden loss of the vendor cause significant disruption to your organization? Would that disruption impact your customers? And if the time for the vendor to recover operations exceeded more than 24 hours, would there be a negative impact on your organization? If you answer yes to any of those three questions, you definitely have a critical vendor. There could be some other considerations your organization chooses to use when defining what is critical, but those three questions work really well. Now, after criticality, the other thing we have to figure out is the types and amounts of risk that are present in that engagement. And we do this through an inherent risk assessment. We rate those risks before we consider any potential controls. So this is like the raw risk. And that inherent risk rating is going to be your guide on how to treat and manage that vendor and determines everything from the scope of initial due diligence, the documents you'll need to collect, and contractual requirements. It also determines how to continuously monitor and manage that relationship throughout its lifetime. Typically, these risk ratings are on a scale of low, moderate, and high risk. Now, there is a point after due diligence is completed that you can then calculate your residual risk, but we will talk about that a little bit later. So just to review, first we determine if a vendor is critical or non-critical, and we determine this for every vendor. Then we conduct a risk assessment to establish the risk rating or risk level of that vendor. Remember, critical is not a risk rating, and every vendor should be deemed as critical or non-critical and have an associated risk rating. If you're wondering what types of risk we might be looking for in that inherent risk assessment, here are some of the most common risks we could consider. Remember, your organization may have more or different types depending on your business and your internal requirements. I'm not going to go through all of these, but let me just pick out a few. So first, we have compliance risk or the risk of breaking law. We have cyber risk, which speaks to literally everything data or technology related. And some organizations are capturing privacy risk under cyber risk, while some put it under compliance risk, or you can have your own privacy risk category. Operational risk, which covers everything associated with running our business, including business continuity and disaster recovery. Reputational risk, that one pretty much speaks for itself, and transactional risk that can occur when we are processing payments. Now, while you ponder those risks, I think we're ready for our first poll question. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first poll question is, does your vendor risk management framework clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the stakeholder? Yes, we have detailed roles and responsibilities for each stakeholder. Partially, we have some roles and responsibilities defined. No, but we are in the process of defining them. Not at all, or you don't know. And Hillary, it looks like we have some time right now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, who should be conducting risk assessments?
Okay, good question, and it has kind of a long answer. So first of all, when we're talking about risk assessments, let's be clear that in your process, there's usually two risk assessments. The first one is the inherent risk assessment, which you take to identify the types and amounts of risks in the relationship. And that should be conducted by the vendor owner or the vendor manager. Now, when it comes to vendor risk assessments, typically speaking, the vendor should be filling out a questionnaire and returning it back to your third-party risk management group or whatever, and subject matter experts should be looking at that information and determining the sufficiency of the controls, the answers they provided in the questionnaire, etc. So inherent risk is the vendor owner. Vendor risk is SMEs.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. We know it helps your peers when they can see how others are handling the process. Those results are on your screen for review. And by the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or a heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show those reactions. Okay, Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, let's jump right back into our inherent risk discussion for a moment. I wanted to share some examples of how those risks might be considered and translated into your inherent risk questionnaire. Again, I'm not going to go through everything, but I wanted to point out a few in particular. So, questions you might ask about compliance risk. Do we rely on this product or service in order to maintain compliance with any regulatory guidance? Or Is this a significantly regulated product or service? Debt collection is a really good example there. There's cybersecurity. Is this a technology-related service that will in any way require integration with our network? Or will or does the vendor have access to our network? Or reputational risk. Does this product or service in any way impact our clients and our customers? Will they directly interact with them? I think you get the picture. The important thing here is to understand how those inherent risks are going to translate into your due diligence and vendor risk assessment process. So what about that risk assessment process? First of all, regardless of criticality or risk level, there is a basic level of information you should gather about any vendor. Now again, let's use that rule of proportionality. We may not find everything in the list, the left list applies, but in general, for every vendor, we need the name, address, phone number, and websites of the company. See if you can get a picture of the location and make sure it exists. Confirm that the business is a legal entity in good standing by checking out their tax ID and business license. Research the company to make sure you understand its ownership structure. And make sure they have basic liability instruction. Now, quick word about this one because insurance can be a really tricky thing, and as the process develops, you might add additional insurance requirements for your vendor based on the product type. So, for example, making sure they have a cyber insurance policy if they access data. But in the beginning, basic liability insurance should be the price of entry here. And if you can get them, references or customer reviews. Now, as you start dealing with those vendor relationships that have an elevated risk, you'll need to add additional due diligence, requiring your vendor to complete that questionnaire and give you back all the documentation. What that is exactly may vary, but we'll share some examples here shortly. Now, just to review, the vendor isn't going to provide you with all the information you are going to need. So your organization has to do some research. And that research, again, is going to vary depending on the product or service. The information you gather combined with the vendor risk questionnaire and the due diligence documentation should allow your organization to determine if the risk is acceptable and if you should formally engage the vendor for a business relationship. The evaluation of the risk after due diligence is completed is known as residual risk, and I promise we're going to get to that. Before we jump into due diligence, I just want to pause for a moment to talk about the importance of questionnaires. First, both your inherent questionnaire and your vendor risk questionnaire should be standardized. That means we're asking the same questions for each engagement. That standardization supports our risk tiering and lets us look at data more objectively. If we don't have standardized questionnaires and processes, it's likely that our process will devolve into subjectivity, and the likelihood that we will miss something that's important really increases. So people are always going to complain about filling out questionnaires. It happens, and it will happen. And it does not matter if that questionnaire is only 10 questions or 500 questions. But here's where you need to hold your ground. This is a really important tool for risk assessment. After all, you're putting all your money, revenue, information security, reputation, and even regulatory compliance on the line, so we can't afford to have unstable or overly flexible processes that increase the opportunity for errors. So it's time to jump into some due diligence examples. Over the next few slides, we're going to look at some of the mitigating control areas to consider and some of the due diligence we might collect to validate the controls. Now keep in mind, these are all examples and are not meant to be wholly comprehensive. Again, your organization has to determine what controls to consider and what due diligence to collect. But starting with this example, this vendor accesses, transfers, processes, stores sensitive information. So there's a lot of different risk types associated with this activity, including information security, privacy, compliance, etc. So when it comes to those documents, we're going to have a pretty long list of items the vendor will need to provide. To highlight a few, we're going to need those independent third-party audits like SOC 2 reports. We need their policies. We need proof of regulatory compliance. We need to see how they manage their third parties. And we need proof that they risk assess those third parties and monitor them. We also are going to need some very specific and technical information regarding system vulnerability and penetration testing. So in this example, we're looking at kind of the whole kit and caboodle of information, and it's a lot to digest. But let's compare this to the next example. Now, in this example, the vendor only accesses sensitive data, and they're doing that through our system using a login and password. So we're still dealing with sensitive data, and that is a high-risk activity. But some of the control considerations have shifted slightly. We can see those areas that are grayed out on this slide are not specific concerns for this particular engagement. The focus here might be less on the technical aspects, but more on the people, compliance, and privacy controls. I use this example to help everyone understand the importance of really knowing and understanding the activity when you're establishing the due diligence requirements. In this example, the vendor is directly interacting with our customers or clients. So we have to address those people, privacy, and compliance controls pretty strongly. But we also have to have a good focus on reputation. We want proof that they're licensed, and if necessary, that they have robust compliance requirements and training for their employees. We're also going to really want to dive into that privacy policy. Now for a biggie. This vendor has been deemed critical. Obviously, we have a lot of operational controls we need to review, especially business continuity and disaster recovery. We need really good service level agreements, and we need to understand how they train and manage their employees and proof of regulatory compliance. Now, I know that there is a glaring omission on this slide. Take a look and see if you can figure out what is missing. If you identified financials, you're 100% correct. The financial health of our critical vendors is imperative, so we need to dive into that. It's important that our vendors can sustain their business throughout the life of the contract, but it's also imperative that we validate that those critical vendors are financially stable enough to support our operations in such a material way. We have just a few more examples to illustrate how the focus on specific controls might shift or change depending on the situation and the product or service provided. In this example, we have a lot of costs associated with this vendor. Maybe we just spent millions of dollars integrating them into our systems. And it isn't a matter of being able to quickly switch to another vendor should they fail. So similar to that critical vendor, we need to ensure that they are financially healthy and that they can sustain their operation. We want good service level agreements, and we need to know about their business continuity and disaster recovery. So, of course, we're going to look at those independent third-party audits, financials, all the certifications, etc. For the last example, this vendor has unescorted access to the facilities. The focus here would really be on those controls that ensure the vendor has good hiring practices and does background checks. In this case, we need to evidence the background check for each individual that has access. We also need to know that those employees are properly trained in both privacy and compliance. And we want to know how the vendor is managing employee access. Like, what do they do if an employee quits or is fired? How do they handle that process? So, of course, we're going to want that list of those specific employees. We're going to want evidence of privacy and compliance training. We want all the policies and procedures, and we want to see their access management process. All right, we've talked about all the things that you might need to collect, but what happens if you can't get something? Because every last one of us is going to experience that feeling of frustration when that vendor tells us that they can't or won't provide information. Many times this happens because the vendor is very large and doesn't really have the resources to answer every due diligence questionnaire or document request. You see this a lot with large public companies like Google, AT&T, national banks, those kind of things. Usually this isn't as bad as it seems because many organizations often post their policies and such online. You may have to do some internet researching to get what you need. On the other hand, there are always those vendors that either don't have the information you need or don't want to share what they have. In the first case, let's say you have a startup vendor who can't provide a SOC 2 Type 2 report because they're only in their second year of business. Okay, fair enough, but the burden of proof is still on them if they want the business. They've got to come up with some alternative documentation or other methods that can evidence they have the necessary controls. In many cases, an on-site visit can satisfy some of these requests. In others, it's recommended that your subject matter expert has an interview with one of their senior leaders and really discusses those specific controls. If there is an outright refusal to provide proof of controls, you have to wonder why, right? In some cases, that reason may be that the proof doesn't exist, and that should raise a big red flag. You need to document all your discussions. If there is a legitimate business reason that a vendor cannot provide what you've requested, you should document that too, as well as any alternative methods used and if the controls were deemed sufficient by that SME. In some cases, your business may choose to accept the risk, but any risk acceptances or waivers should come from senior management and the board if it's a critical vendor. Finally, if an exception needs to be made, add terms to the contract when it's appropriate to provide you the necessary information within a specific time. So get that remediation in the contract. So you've been waiting for it, and now we're going to talk about residual risk. So up to this point, we've conducted our inherent risk rating, and we needed to decide if we can accept the risk as it is, right? It's really unlikely that any of us are just going to move ahead and accept the risk of the relationship based on inherent risk. Chances are there's something that can and should be done to determine the level of risk we really want to be exposed to. Typically, we do that by implementing or evaluating existing controls. Then we can come to that determination of what the residual risk is. So here's how it works. First, you have to identify the risk. Then you need to mitigate the risks you find unacceptable or treat them. Once you treat those risks, meaning you've been able to reduce the likelihood, severity, occurrence, or impact of that risk, then you should have a residual risk score that reflects that. The point is that your organization needs to know and decide if the planned treatment is enough or not. You're not going to be able to completely eliminate all the risks because it's simply not possible. Therefore, some risks will remain at certain levels. And this is what we talk about when we refer to a risk appetite. Or another way to think about this would be if maybe your organization is okay taking big risks because there's a big payoff. Or maybe your organization prefers minimal risk and more security. If you're in a situation where your risk was high, for example, and after you apply all your controls, the risk is still high, you might want to stop and review. You might need to see if more additional or different due diligence documentation is needed or those controls are needed to effectively assess the risk. But we definitely don't want to go forward if our residual risk is exactly the same as our inherent risk. I just want to pause for a moment and talk about controls just a little bit more. Because we usually have such a wide variety of participants on our webinars, I want to make sure that everyone really has a good working knowledge of what is meant by controls. So controls are essentially a combination of people, processes, and tools that are put in place to prevent or detect or correct issues caused by unwanted events. So when we talk about mitigating controls, we can be talking about internal or external controls. And some examples of having internal controls might be requiring a separation of duties so that the person approving the expense is not the same one writing the check, or ensuring that a quorum of committee members are present before taking an important vote. Employee background checks are another example. Another example would be if you're engaging a vendor to provide customer service at a call center. One of the risks in that activity is customer dissatisfaction. So ensuring customer service agents are well trained in both issue remediation and appropriate messaging is one of the controls you might use to address the risk of customer dissatisfaction. Now, Mitigation through the application of controls is one of 4 risk handling techniques, and we haven't really talked about the other ones, so let's take a minute and do that. The first technique is to accept the risk. The point of risk management is to understand the risk and decide if the risk is acceptable. And there are going to be times when risk just can't be mitigated, and it's part of doing business. The point is to make sure that the leaders are aware and can make good informed decisions about how to handle that. Sometimes that decision will just be to accept the risk. The best practice in accepting the risk would be to make sure it's documented with justification. The next technique is to transfer the risk. Now, we always say you can outsource the activity, but you can't outsource the risk. We shouldn't get outsource and transfer confused. The best examples of how to transfer the risk would be by way of insurance policies or contractual terms that still hold you accountable but transfer the financial impact to another party, such as an insurer. The organization can transfer liability to someone else, but ultimately they're accountable. The next technique is just to avoid it. Don't do it. Your inherent risk assessment can help you understand if there are avoidable risks. Examples are don't send any more information than you need to, or don't use certain methods for transferring data. Having good risk-based training in your organization is a great way to help everyone do their part in risk avoidance. And then there's mitigation and controls. So assuming that all your controls are effective and you've been able to reduce your residual risk, it's probably a safe bet that you can move forward with that vendor engagement. Just remember, you still need to keep your eye on things, whether that's through ongoing monitoring, that periodic due diligence, or just simply staying aware of the events going on that might impact your third party. I do want to be very clear here. Residual risk scores are not a risk rating. It is merely a measure of effective control. So why is this important? Because the whole purpose of residual risk is to help inform your organization whether the planned treatment of those risks was sufficient. And again, when it comes to sufficient, it's up to your organization to define their risk tolerance. So use your residual risk score wisely, and remember that it's only a tool to help the organization decide if the vendor engagement is within the risk tolerance. Don't use that residual risk rating to set your monitoring schedule or your performance requirements, because that is an audit or exam finding waiting to happen. So while you think about that, I think we have another poll. Jesse?
Our second poll question of the day is, does your current vendor risk management process calculate and consider residual risk? Yes. No, but we are planning to. No, or you're unsure. And Hillary, I have another question here that I think we can go ahead and answer.
Okay.
And that question is, can I use the same assessment for all my vendors?
Yes and no. So you can use the same questionnaire or the same questions, but the actual assessment is the finished result. So no, you can't use the finished result for all of your vendors, but if you want to use the same set of questions and the same questionnaire, that is a recommended best practice. That consistency will make sure that your organization isn't missing any important details and that you're looking at things on more of an apples to apples objective basis versus subjective. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Hillary. And as a reminder, we will be answering questions at the end of the session today. Please feel free to submit those in the Ask Question widget. Any questions we do not have time to answer during the live session, we will follow up with you directly. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before we move on, I would like to remind you that a copy of our What Are Inherent and Residual Third-Party Risk ebook is available in the Related Content widget. It provides helpful tips on these risks, the differences between these risks, and how to handle them. You'll also find a copy of our infographics, which is Identifying Critical Vendors, 6 Foolproof Vendors. These questions will help you easily determine who your critical and non-critical vendors are. Back to you, Hillary.
I want to point out the importance of issue management in this whole process. It is essential. And first of all, when it comes to issues, new or emerging risks can pop up at any time. They just don't wait until your risk review to show up. So we need to keep our eyes on things. But issues that are identified during due diligence or those subsequent risk reviews need to be documented, tracked, and reported. And we especially need to flag any issues that are at risk or past due for closure. We also need to make sure there's an established issue escalation path to ensure that these issues get managed appropriately on time. And sometimes that just takes a little added pressure from the higher levels of the organization. Keep in mind that issues related to critical vendors should be reported to the board. All right, so you all know about vendor risk assessments now. You might be wondering if you have enough resources to get it all done. Here's some considerations for you. The first thing is make sure you standardize your processes and limit exceptions. This makes it much easier to get through. People get used to it. It's very time efficient. Make sure your vendor risk management activities are always in proportion to the risk. Don't do more than you need to, but make sure you're doing as much as you should. Look at your administrative activities and see if there's redundancies that you can automate. One way to automate is to use vendor risk management software. So that allows you to get rid of all those manual workflows and spreadsheets and individual emails, the reporting, etc. A big one here is making sure that your vendor owners know how to perform their responsibilities and hold them accountable for doing it. And then last but not least, if you're really still overwhelmed and due diligence and risk reviews are piling up, consider outsourcing it. There are lots of organizations that do a great job with these third-party risk management services. And the best part is that you can actually often shorten the cycle time and improve your internal bandwidth so you can focus on other things.
Our next poll question is, the workload for the vendor risk management function at my organization is manageable. The workloads are reasonable for the role and resources, and required activities are completed on time. Outputs are of the expected quality. It's challenging. The workloads are heavy for the role and resources. Required activities are not always accomplished on time, and quality is not consistent. C, it's unsustainable. The workload is unreasonable for the roles and resources. Required activities are rarely completed on time. There are frequent errors or low quality output. There are no words, so don't ask, or you're unsure. And Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that question is, if I'm monitoring a vendor through a monitoring service, do I need to conduct a risk assessment?
Yes. The short answer is yes. But let me give a little bit of an explanation. So risk monitoring services, alert services, are really helpful tools to help you keep your eye on vendors between formal periodic risk assessments. But we always need to do a formalized, documented risk assessment for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that we understand all the existing types of risk and amounts of risk in an engagement, and to look for any new or emerging risks. Unfortunately, those monitoring services might bring risks to your attention, but they're not going to help you formalize that through documentation. So yes, you always do need to conduct a risk assessment.
And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. Before we continue, I just want to remind everyone you can take a look at our what, why, when, who, where of vendor risk assessments infographic within the related content widget. This infographic provides valuable information related to vendor risk assessments. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
All right. It's not a coincidence that we asked that poll question right after we talked about resource constraints. But to wrap it all up today, I want to just share some risk assessment best practices. So again, let's standardize those processes, limit our exceptions. We want to make sure that we document the general risk methodology and minimum requirements in the policy so that everybody's clear on what that is. follow that vendor risk management lifecycle. It was developed for the purpose of managing risk throughout the relationship, and it is a best practice. Never use your residual risk score in place of an inherent risk rating, especially when determining what vendor risk activities need to happen, either the amount or the frequency, because that is just going to be a huge mess. Track, manage, and report your vendor issues. Make sure that you have good escalation paths there and you have visibility so that people know they're on the hook for solving those problems. Consider outsourcing some of your activities if you need more capacity. A good reason to do this is a lot of our SMEs are internal folks that wear multiple hats, and they often have to juggle priorities, and sometimes we're waiting for their review because they're dealing with other things. And then always strive for improvement, right? Progress, not perfection, because no process is perfect, no program is perfect, but continuous improvement is an excellent goal. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone very much for your time and attention today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I want to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some really important information. We hope you've learned a lot. Later this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we will be hosting another vendor risk assessment session that will go into more detail regarding how to complete a vendor risk assessment. You can register for that session on our site at venminder.com/webinar, or if you're already registered, we look forward to you joining us again shortly. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On July 12th, Strategies to Mature Your Vendor Risk Management Program, and on July 28th, How to Effectively Evaluate a Vendor's Performance. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for these is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Before we begin answering more questions that have come in during this session, I want to let everyone know that you can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Once today's session ends, it doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, such as vendor risk assessment material and many other resources related to third-party risk management topics. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. Okay, let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, you listed financial risk as a type of vendor risk. Could you explain if that's financial risk to the company or if that is the vendor's financial risk?
Well, it actually can be both. So we look at financial risk in terms of like how much are we putting out for this engagement? Like in my example where I mentioned that we've invested a lot in maybe integrating that product or service, there's definitely financial risk there. But we also want to look at the financial risk of the vendor themselves. So are they financially healthy? Can they sustain their business throughout the length of the contract? So when you're looking at financial risk, there are two components: risk to your company's finances, revenues, investments, and the risk that the vendor may be not so financially healthy.
Okay, great. Next question. Can you calculate residual risk before due diligence is completed?
Not really. I mean, the whole point of residual risk is to gauge how effective those controls are. So you really do need to analyze them. Well, one, make sure the controls exist, and two, have your subject matter expert review them to see how effective they are. Once you have that information, you're really a lot more better positioned to calculate that residual risk.
Okay, great. Our next question. We want to outsource some of our vendor risk duties, but management has not been open to that idea. Could you suggest anything to help us build a good business case for that?
There's a couple things that you can do. The first of which, is to document what the issue is. For example, maybe your business lines are complaining that it's taking way too long to get through those vendor risk reviews, right? And that may be because, again, your internal people who are serving as these subject matter experts have other issues or responsibilities. And so, your risk review may be reprioritized at any time. The problem with that is that your company, your organization is bringing on that vendor for a specific reason. So we're either trying to solve a problem or realize some sort of opportunity. The longer it takes to cycle through those reviews, that's delaying that realization of that opportunity or longer that the problem's going on. So that is a major area I like to suggest when you're building that business case, is to just really point out that there is a cost to too long cycle time and a cost to poor quality. So like if you are doing it internally and maybe you're missing some things and you keep going back to the drawing board, there's a cost to that. So that's one. The other is to make sure that they understand one of the reasons that there's delays potentially is because these folks are dealing with other issues. So now we've got an internal bandwidth problem, and you're creating a prioritization nightmare for some of these folks. So really highlighting the fact that by moving some of this out to qualified third-party risk, service companies, can not only shorten your cycle time, but it does improve bandwidth overall, so people can give more attention and more sustained attention to other issues. I hope that helps.
That's great. Our next question: what kind of due diligence should we collect for consultants?
So it's really interesting. I've been getting asked this question in all kinds of forums about what type of due diligence to do for a specific type of company. And what I'd like to kind of reframe people or redirect them to thinking about is that it's not the type of company. It's not a consultant versus an internet company. It's really what are the risks that are present in that engagement. So if you use your inherent risk assessment and you determine that, maybe with that consultant, they might have some access to sensitive data or to your systems, the due diligence should align with those risks, regardless of what type of. So if there's information security risks, then we need to do information security due diligence. If there's privacy risk, we need to do privacy due diligence. Again, this is a little bit of a balance, right? Making sure that we are using that rule of proportionality, but don't get hung up on what type of industry or business it is. Focus on the activity that's happening and the risks that are present in that activity to guide your due diligence.
Okay, great. Next question: are there standardized risk questionnaires that could be used across the board? There's
lots of risk questionnaires that are available. I think that, again, as I mentioned in the presentation, you do need to standardize your risk questionnaires, especially your inherent risk questionnaire. That questionnaire should not be overly expensive, maybe about 20 questions to give you that first line look into what types of risks are there and how much risk is there. From there, there's your vendor risk management questionnaire. There are as many of those out there as, there are vendors, I'm sure. There are some organizations, so for example, if you've heard of something called SIG-LITE or SIG, which are standard information gathering questionnaires. Some people use those, but it doesn't matter as much which ones you're using as long as you are standardizing that data collection and the questions you ask.
Okay, great. Next question is a risk assessment the same as a business impact analysis?
I'm sorry, Jessica, can you repeat that?
Sure. Is a risk assessment the same as a business impact analysis?
Okay, great. No, they're not. So a business impact analysis is really a review and analysis of how your business might be impacted due to certain events or activities. So for example, if there's a major power outage, what would be the impact to your business? You know, were there specific products or services that would go down? Maybe some are more important than others. You know, if it's from maybe there's a hurricane and you have 2 offices in the path of that hurricane, how would they be affected? So business impact analysis is really looking at what could happen. So it's very much in line and is a counterpart to your business continuity and disaster recovery. Your risk assessment is really looking at what types of risk are present in that product or service. So I have a service that uses confidential or sensitive data, then I should be able to determine that I have privacy risk, compliance risk, cyber risk, etc. So they're not the same and should not be used interchangeably.
Okay, perfect. And I think we have time for one more question. Would all critical vendors be considered high risk also?
This is a very good question, and it can be a little tricky. So the first thing to remember is that most critical vendors are also high risk because the activity or the thing that they're doing that makes them critical usually has high risk associated to it. That is not to say that all high risk vendors are critical, because they're not. I saw an example this morning where someone was mentioning their ISP provider as being critical to their business, but that it was relatively low risk. So you can have a critical vendor that is not high risk, but just keep in mind that high risk and critical are not interchangeable. Criticality is business impact. Risk is the types and amounts of risk present.
Okay, great. And we actually have time for just one more. And that question is, would it make sense to create different risk assessment templates for different types of vendors, such as one for landscapers or painters versus an online hosted service provider?
So here is a suggestion. When we talk about those risk assessments being standardized, the inherent risk assessment, a lot of times when we're talking about very low risk vendors, so, you know, the guy who brings the donut or, you know, the people who, you know, hose down the sidewalk outside, it feels weird to actually create this risk assessment that doesn't really apply. However, there are certain types of low risk categories that have very similar attributes. So your landscaper, the caterer, etc. If you have resources and time to do this, what I recommend is doing sort of a blanket risk assessment for those types. So what are all the similar attributes in a catering event, for example? They're all low, no access to information, no unescorted access to the facility. You can then say that, yes, if we know it's a catering company and it meets these requirements, that we'll put this low risk on it and no, nothing else is required. But to be honest, very few organizations are at the point where they can fine tune it to that degree. If you can, great. But I still say standardize your risk assessment to identify that risk. And if you want to, explore those categories and say, if it falls into this category and these things are true, low risk, and we don't have to do anything else. I hope that made sense.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary as well for her time and great content. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.